We're sold a fantasy of healing, a cleaner scent, a glow up, a neat line from broken to fixed. That's not what healing looks like. And I say that as someone who has been orphaned twice, who had 7 caregivers by the age of 10, who has lived through multiple forms of abuse, homelessness, racism, depression, divorce, single motherhood, and more recently, breast cancer. So in this video, I want to offer you a more honest picture of healing. Hi, I'm Rebecca Monique, an accredited grief and trauma coach. My work lives in all the places that grief hides: endings, beginnings, love, loss, identity, race, womanhood, healing, and more. In this space, I offer gentle guidance to help deepen your reflective practice and to restore connection to others, to the world, and most importantly, to yourself. Thank you for pausing here with me. Let's begin. I recently wrote a reflective essay called What Healing Really Looks Like: The Unseen, Unspoken Journey of Grief and Repair. In the full essay, I explore some of the truths and tensions that go unnamed in healing. For this video, I'm going to walk you through 6 of the most poignant reflections, and I'll also guide you through the secondary losses and grief gains reflective practice that sits alongside it. You can download the essay and reflective practice via my newsletter sign-up link in the description. If you need to, grab a notebook, grab some tissues, or simply stay here with me. Healing is not linear. What I want to do first is gently dismantle the fantasy. We are taught to expect a version of healing that is neat, linear, efficient, and easy to recognize. An image where healing behaves, progresses on time, makes us calmer, kinder, more forgiving, less complicated. An image where pain becomes tidy and growth arrives on schedule. But real healing is rarely that obedient. One of the first things healing asks us to unlearn is the myth that it's supposed to look a certain way at all. Healing is not a standardized process, and it absolutely is not a neat line from broken to fixed, from wounded to wise, from grief to grace. It does not move politely. It does not always make sense while you're inside it. Some days healing feels jagged. Some days it feels almost disarmingly ordinary. Some days it feels like a return to the very terrain you thought that you'd already crossed. But return is not always regression. Sometimes it's a bow being drawn. What feels like backwards movement may actually be the gathering of force, the necessary pull before release, before clearer sight and steadier aim. Sometimes healing asks us to revisit old ground, not because that we failed, but because something in us is still being prepared. And that is one of the hardest things to accept. Healing does not always feel like obvious progress. Sometimes it feels like circling. Sometimes it feels like pausing. Sometimes it feels like remembering what you thought that you had already dealt with. But that doesn't mean that nothing's happening. It may mean that something deeper is integrating. Healing has its own rhythm. It does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it moves like a dance. A few steps forward, a turn, a bow, a rise. And each time, if we stay with it, we move with a little bit more freedom, a little bit more grace, a little bit more embodied power. What looks from the outside like inconsistency is often just a very real rhythm of being human. There's a grief concept called the dual process model, and one of the reasons that I find it so useful is because it reminds us that healthy adaptation often involves oscillation. We move between attending to pain and attending to life. We go forward, we circle back, we rest, we remember, we live, we tend, we move again. That movement is the rhythm of repair. So many people assume that if they're revisiting something, if they're tender again, if they're suddenly activated by something that they thought that they'd already healed, then they must be going backwards. Not necessarily. Sometimes you're not going backwards at all. Sometimes healing is simply bringing you back to something with more capacity than you had before. More honesty, more language, more support, more self-awareness, more room in the body to actually stay with what once overwhelmed you. And sometimes the deepest peace doesn't come from finally getting the answer. Sometimes it comes from loosening your grip to the question, because the ache of why did this happen can keep us circling pain, when what we may be longing for is release, movement, or the possibility of what next. So if your healing has felt messy, cyclical, slow, or underwhelmingly ordinary, that doesn't mean that you're healing wrong. It may simply mean that you're in it. And one of the kindest things that we can do for ourselves is to stop demanding that healing perform like a straight line just because we would find it easier to understand. Because real healing is rarely tidy. It is layered, iterative, sometimes quiet, sometimes jagged, sometimes painfully slow. But none of that makes it less real. And if healing is not linear, then the next thing that we have to reckon with is this. Healing often looks like grief before it looks like peace. This is one of the most confronting truths about healing, because so many of us imagine healing as relief, as resolution, as finally feeling better. But very often healing begins with grief. Grief for what happened, yes, but also grief for what it took. Grief for what it interrupted. Grief for who we had to become in order to survive it. Grief for the years spent adapting to what should never have been treated as normal. Grief for the identities, relationships, certainties, capacities, and futures that cannot come with us into the life healing is asking us to live. And that is part of why healing can feel so disorienting. Because from the outside, it may look like things are getting better. You're more self-aware, more honest, more awake. But from the inside, it can feel like everything is falling away. And sometimes it is. Healing can cost us illusions. It can cost us old loyalties. It can cost us versions of ourselves that were built around survival. It can cost us relationships that depended on our silence, our confusion, our overgiving, our self-abandonment. Real healing is not casual. There comes a point where the way things are becomes so unbearable, so misaligned, so unsustainable that healing no longer feels optional. It becomes the only honest path left. And so yes, healing may eventually bring peace, but before that, it often brings loss and grief. It asks us to mourn not only what happened to us, but everything that happened because of it. And this is where the language of secondary losses becomes so important, because one loss rarely travels alone. When something ruptures in our lives, whether that is bereavement, a breakup, a diagnosis, a trauma, the loss of work, the loss of home, it often sets other losses in motion. Loss of confidence, loss of belonging, identity, trust, health, routine, self-worth, cultural rootedness, relational ease, hope for the future. And sometimes what makes grief feel so heavy is that we think that we're grieving one thing, when in fact we're grieving 10. That's why healing can feel bigger than the original event, because the original event may have had a long shadow. And yet, I also believe that if there are secondary losses, there can also be what I call grief gains. Not the slow silver lining sense, not in the everything happens for a reason sense. I mean the slower, harder won gains that can emerge through real repair, rebuilt self-trust, rebuilt discernment, rebuilt standards, rebuilt connection to the body, a rebuilt relationship to joy, a rebuilt sense of home inside yourself. Some things are not regained, they're rebuilt. And we cherish rebuilt things differently because we know how easy life can take them away. So when I say that healing often looks like grief before it looks like peace, I mean that healing is not only about becoming lighter. Sometimes it's about becoming honest enough to mourn properly, honest enough to name what was taken, honest enough to let some things die so that something truer can live. Because some endings really are mercy in disguise. And sometimes healing is not the relief of getting better. It's the grief of no longer being willing to live the old way. And once grief has done some of its clarifying work, we do not come back to life with the same tolerances. Healing changes our threshold, because healing doesn't only make us more aware, it also makes us less available to what once felt normal. Less available to confusion, chaos, dishonesty, misattunement, urgency, self-betrayal. It changes what we call love and what we deem acceptable. And that brings me to the next reflection. Healing changes what we can tolerate. This is one of the clearest signs that healing is actually happening. Not that we become perfect or untouched, but that we become less willing to keep living in ways that injure us. What once felt bearable can begin to feel impossible. Noise, chaos, dishonesty, misattunement, emotional extraction, false urgency, self-abandonment. All of it starts to register not simply as unpleasant, but incompatible. And that can be disorienting because what healing often changes first is not the world around us, but our ability to keep participating in it in the same way. The old life starts to itch. The old patterns stop fitting. And from the outside, that can look like we have become difficult, too sensitive, too guarded, too much. But often what is really happening is that we are becoming more responsible with what has been made sacred. That is what boundaries often are. Not a sign that we've become hard or cold, or that we're punishing people. Often boundaries are proof that we have become more honest about what harms us, what depletes us, and what we're no longer willing to call love, loyalty, or normality. Healing sharpens hierarchy of access. Not everyone gets our heart or our story. Not everyone gets our softness in equal measure. One of the quieter lies many of us have lived with is that goodness means endless availability, that love means access, that being evolved means tolerating what kept wounding us. But healing teaches the opposite. It teaches discernment, proportion, and that access should be earned and not assumed. And part of what changes here is the relationship that we have with ourselves. One of the most beautiful things healing can produce is the gradual emergence of the inner elder. The inner child may still ache, still reach, still fear, still remember. But over time, that younger self is no longer left alone with the story. Another voice begins to rise, steadier, kinder, less frightened by what hurts, more able to hold, soothe, reassure, and guide. Healing isn't the banishment of the younger self. It is the moment the elder within us becomes strong enough to say, with tenderness, with authority, I know this hurts, I know, and I've got us now. And as that inner elder becomes more present, our relationships with other people begin to change as well. We begin to see people more accurately. Some who were once called friends become acquaintances. Some who were once romantic possibilities become embodiments of scripts that we no longer want to live inside. Some relationships deepen because they can survive truth. Some dissolve because they depended on our confusion, our overgiving, our self-erasure. The familiar is not always safe. Sometimes it's a cage. And yes, healing can feel like loss, but it can also feel like freedom, because there comes a point in healing where our standards are no longer arbitrary, they're protective. They are the new baseline required to maintain the life our healing has made possible. So if your healing has made you more discerning, more boundaried, more careful about who gets access to you, that doesn't automatically mean that you're becoming hard. It may simply mean that you're no longer standing there, you're standing here. And once healing becomes to change what we can tolerate, another truth starts to come into view. Understanding is not always the same as integration. Healing cannot remain only intellectual. We can have insight, we can have language, perspective, even wisdom, and still the body may remain on high alert, still braced, still scanning, still carrying a story of danger, long after the mind has learned new words for safety. Which is why the next reflection is crucial. Healing lives in the body too. We can do so much beautiful work in the mind. We can understand our patterns, name our wounds, make meaning of our history. We can explain exactly why we are the way that we are. And still the body may remain hypervigilant, watchful, waiting for danger, still moving through the world as though something bad is about to happen. And that's why healing can not only remain intellectual. Wounding lives in the nervous system. So must healing. Healing in the body is not metaphorical. It's physiological. Trauma and grief travel through breath, posture, muscle, tension, appetite, pain, fatigue, skin, gut, jaw, shoulders, and pulse. They also shape sleep, vigilance, and the body's sense of safety. And if we have lived in survival mode for a long time, we may not even realize how much of what we call personality is actually adaptation, our nervous system organized around survival. That is such a profound moment because it means that we stop moralizing what the body learned to do in order to protect us. And it also means that we begin to understand why healing could be so much easier said than done, because the mind may know one thing while the body still believes another. The mind may know that we're safe, but the body may still be waiting for danger. And that is where healing has to deepen. We cannot just tell ourselves that we're safe. We have to show ourselves that we are safe through repetition, through breath, through pacing, through touch, through environment, through rhythm, through lived evidence. Sometimes the body needs to be shown again and again that the danger is not happening now. And that process is often slow. Healing often unfolds in increments. The body can only metabolize and integrate so much at once. In somatic work, this is sometimes described as titration, approaching activation or distress in smaller, manageable doses so that the body isn't overwhelmed by more than it can hold. Because healing isn't only about expansion, it's also about containment. The body and mind have to learn how to live inside each new layer of safety, truth, and growth before another layer can be asked of them. If we don't honour that pace, healing can tip into flooding, shutdown, re-traumatization, or a brittle kind of progress that looks like movement, but has not yet been integrated. And one of the cruelest surprises of bodily healing is that safety can initially make things feel worse. Because once the system begins to downshift, what was previously buried may start to surface. Tears, tension, fatigue, old ache, grief. And that doesn't necessarily mean that something is going wrong, but that the body finally has enough space to process what it once had to postpone. And one of the most compassionate things that we can remember is this: your body is not the enemy. Your body is not betraying you. Your body has been fighting for you all along. Healing asks us to stop treating the body as an inconvenience and start relating to it as an ally, because healing lives in the body too. And once we begin to honour the body, we are brought to another truth. Healing is not only solitary. Yes, there are parts of the work that only we can do. No one can grieve for us. No one can surrender for us. No one can turn towards what hurt us on our behalf. But some wounds were shaped in relationship, and some healing can only happen when we are finally met differently. Which brings me to the next reflection. Some parts must be walked alone. Some wounds need witness. One of the loneliest parts of healing is that it changes your perception before it changes your world. You begin to recognize how much of your life was built around adaptation. You notice how many people are committed to functioning while remaining strangers to themselves, and that can feel like exile. There are parts of healing that no one can do for us. Some chambers of the work remain solitary because they require our own consent, our own honesty, our own turning toward what hurts. But healing is not only solitary work. Some wounds were shaped in relationship, and some wounds need witness, safety, and the right kind of relationship holding in order to begin to mend. That is part of why community matters. But not any community, not proximity for proximity's sake, but safe witness, safe co-regulation, safe community. I often think here of an African proverb: a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. It says something devastating and true about unmet need, about what becomes of us when care is withheld, because left without warmth, attunement, or relational input, wounds do not always soften into healing. Sometimes they harden or calcify. So many of us have been taught a hyper-individual understanding of healing, a very Western understanding, a very private one, a very self-contained one, as though healing is something we do neatly within ourselves, in isolation, through enough insight and enough effort. But many traditions have always known otherwise. Across many indigenous and African-rooted traditions, healing is understood far more communally, through ritual, kinship, spirituality, land, ancestors, witness, rhythm, and shared responsibility. In those frameworks, healing is not only something that we do within ourselves, but it is also something held around us. And for those of us in the diaspora, that can open another layer of grief, because sometimes healing is not only about what happened to us personally, but about what was interrupted collectively. Language, land, ritual, ancestry, community, the ordinary intimacy of belonging. Sometimes healing looks like returning toward practices we were never fully taught, but still somehow long for. Prayer, song, story, elder wisdom, communal witness, ancestral remembrance, food, ceremony, land, ways of being that remind the body it comes from somewhere. For the uprooted, healing is not always a neat homecoming. Sometimes it's a slow remembering of what exile tried to scatter. And yet, even as we reach towards that return, we may have to reckon with another grief. Not everyone around us can meet us there. You can't expect oak tree holding from potted plants. Some of the people we most hoped would hold us simply do not have the depth, capacity, courage, or rootedness to do so. And that recognition hurts, but it can also be freeing, because through healing we learn where to place our tenderness, who can hold it, who cannot, and what kinds of witness actually help us heal. So yes, some parts must be walked alone, but some wounds need witness. And part of healing is recognizing which wounds require solitude, and which begin to mend in safe company. And even when we understand that healing may need witness, community, and the right conditions around us, we also have to name a harder social truth. Not everybody gets access to those conditions equally. This is one of the most important truths that we need to say out loud, because healing is so often spoken about as though it happens outside of material conditions, as though everyone has the same time, the same safety, the same support, the same privacy, the same money, the same body, the same margin. But that simply isn't true. Not everybody gets to heal in spacious conditions. Not everybody gets to heal with rest, with slowness, with community, with access to support, or with the luxury of stepping back from ordinary demands. For many people, healing is happening in the middle of labor, in the middle of caregiving, of housing insecurity, in the middle of financial strain, in the middle of illness, racism, in the middle of systems that do not make much room for fragility, grief, or repair. And if we're not careful, healing discourse can become quietly cruel by romanticizing what is actually privilege. It can make people feel as though that they are failing because their healing does not look like retreat, spacious mornings, long walks, therapy language, or soft focused transformation. But for many people, healing looks far less elegant than that. It looks like snatched moments of honesty in the middle of responsibility. It looks like regulating in fragments, grieving between shifts. It looks like choosing not to abandon yourself even when life does not loosen its grip. Sometimes healing does not look like slow restoration. It looks like refusing to collapse in conditions that never fully allow for exhale. And that does not make the healing lesser. It makes it harder won, more constrained, more demanding of an already stretched life. It also means that we have to stop pretending healing is only about mindset. Healing is also shaped by context, by race, by class, by labor, by health, by caregiving, by housing, by whether the world around you gives you enough safety to put anything down at all. So when someone is healing slowly, unevenly, messily, or in fragments, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're resisting the work. It may mean that they're doing the work under conditions that make healing far more costly. Naming that is part of compassion, part of truth, part of refusing to let healing become another place where people are measured against standards that were never built with their lives in mind. So those are some of the reflections I explore in the essay. 6 reflections to be precise. In the full piece, I also write about self-forgiveness, psychosomatic healing, and some of the philosophies and spiritual frameworks that can help us hold grief without bypassing it. And because healing can be difficult to name while we are inside it, I also created a reflective practice to sit alongside the essay. You might remember that earlier in the video I spoke about how one loss rarely travels alone, how grief can bring not only primary loss but secondary losses too. And I also wanted to make room for grief gains as well. So before I close, I want to briefly walk you through that reflective practice. Sometimes we think that we're grieving one thing when in fact we're grieving the life around it too. The confidence it took, the routine it disrupted, the identity it unsettled, the trust it fractured, the belonging it altered. So in the reflective practice, I invite you to begin with your primary loss. That might be bereavement, a breakup, a diagnosis, the loss of a job, the loss of home. And then around that, you begin naming the secondary losses, the quieter ones, the less obvious ones. Then in the second part of the practice, I invite you to consider grief gains, not forced gratitude, not the pressure to find something beautiful before it's time. I mean the slower, harder won things that may have been rebuilt through your healing. Things like discernment, self-trust, boundaries, a deeper relationship with yourself, a more honest life, a different relationship to joy. The practice is there to help you name both what grief has taken and what healing may have rebuilt. So if this video resonated with you, I really encourage you to download the reflective practice and spend a little time with it. As always, you don't need to rush it. You do not need to complete it perfectly. You just need to meet it honestly. So if there's one thing that I hope this video leaves you with, it's this. Healing does not have to be tidy to be true. It does not have to be linear to be real. And it does not have to look beautiful from the outside in order to be doing something beautiful within you. If your healing has felt messy, slow, lonely, costly, or hard to name, I hope this video has reminded you that none of that makes it less valid. It may simply mean that you are in the thick of something real. I hope these reflections have given you a more honest picture of the road and a little more compassion for where you're standing. If you want to go deeper, you can download the full essay and the secondary losses and grief gains reflective practice through the link in the description. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, be well.